I would like to introduce myself as a reason that ICWA exists. I was born in 1959. I was adopted in 1961 by a white couple. And they were like a lot of people during that era. My mom just wanted a baby, and my dad wanted to save a poor Indian child.
All I can remember is that, my skin was dark, and that other kids, they were all white kids at my school. So what I would do is I would take toothpaste and I'd put it on my hands and I would rub it on my arms and I'd rub it on my neck and my face. And even though it burned real bad, it kind of, in my mind, it made me look more white so I would fit in.
It was me. They hurt like me. They longed for their home. They wanted to come home to their people.
It almost killed me, but being brought back to the circle with our people is what saved me.
We've just seen so many instances over the years where Indian children have basically come to discover that they are really tribal members, but they never knew that before, and the reason they didn't is because the Indian Child Welfare Act was not applied to them and did not protect them.
Having Native children adopted into non-Indian families and having them assimilate and not recognizing their heritage, who they are as Native people, and having that contact with their respective tribe, and basically just having them become a part of mainstream society. There are those that probably say, well, that's what it should be, we're all Americans. Yes, however, we are Native Americans.
Indian children placed in non-Indian settings suffer consequences when they come into adolescence, and as adults they have difficulty in education, in work, in interpersonal relationships, because they don't feel like they fit in either place.
Well, it's horrendous. It's a horrendous disruption. It's devastating to the child. It's a great loss to the family, and it's a great loss to the community, because where are your leaders going to come from if you're not raising your own children?
I should have been able to be raised in my culture with my family, knowing where I came from, and not having to discover that 34, 35 years later.
The BIA boarding schools were the first attempt to try and shape what the future of Indian people would look like. Tribes signed treaties that guaranteed they'd be entitled to food, clothes, blankets, while being confined to the reservation, often without the weapons that were necessary to hunt and survive. And now the federal government is telling them, if you're unwilling to surrender your children to go to these schools, we'll withhold food and clothes and blankets. So the parents are left with the decision, do I give up my little ones to go to these schools, or do I let my whole family starve? And the effort was to kill the Indian and save the child, which was progressive thinking for that time period. In the late 50s, early 60s, CWLA, the Child Welfare League of America, was the cutting edge thinking on what progressive child rearing practices ought to be. They got together with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, created the Indian Adoption Project. The justification for the Indian Adoption Project was the use of the rubric of neglect to justify the fact that these children were being deprived of a good life because they were still tied to notions of tradition and culture.
On the Potawatomi Reservation in Hannibal, Michigan, the families made their living by harvesting pulpwood, and they would go out as a couple and gather and harvest this pulpwood, leaving the older children to watch the younger children. Social workers found out that they were doing this, and they came in and they got almost 200 children. And those parents were charged with child neglect, and they never saw those children again.
One of the reservations still didn't have electricity. So children were removed because it was considered a not safe environment. And yet, not too many decades, before that, you could go many places in rural America and people were still, using kerosene lanterns for light. So I don't consider that a good excuse. I consider that that was just somebody using middle class standards and values to judge how other people live.
In the mid-1970s, Congress did an assessment of life in Indian country, and the rates varied from state to state, but they were pretty consistent, that Indian kids were removed much more often than was necessary. That became the driving force for the adoption of the Indian Child Welfare Act.
So when the Indian Child Welfare Act was written in 1978, it literally started the process of saving the Indian family. I feel that to my very bones, that was a great piece of legislation, a wonderful change in attitude. And then, of course, the question became, could our courts understand it and implement it? And that's been much slower.
After roughly 30 years of ICWA, the Government Accountability Office looked at the question of disproportional representation of minorities in the system. And what they found were that Indians were still out of home much more often than was necessary. And a couple of years later, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges looked, and some states had gotten better and some had gotten a little bit worse. Some had gotten dramatically worse. I think the primary reason that ICWA has not produced the results that we hoped for was that, in my mind, it's probably the least well understood piece of federal legislation and least consistently enforced piece.
I mean, we're still talking about Indian Child Welfare Act seminars as being critical to new judges, and we still have judges who don't understand it. I think it's fascinating the way that the culture of the tribe is reflected in its court proceedings, and the dominant culture of the state courts is reflected in its proceedings. One example that comes to mind, because I work so much in this area, is in child welfare cases, the tribe wants to get everybody together and have a meeting. And that's just not biological family. It's everybody in the community who's interested sit around and they talk and they try to come up with an answer. Well, how interesting is that? And this, to me, is a classic example of the indigenous tribal approach to family matters, teaching the dominant culture that maybe there's a better way. And I, to my very soul, believe it is a better way. It's a better way because the adversarial process is bad for families.
We are now at a place where I think there are things that they have that we need to know, and there are things that the state court has that the tribal courts need to know. And if we can get to the place where we do that mutual sharing, we can begin to develop systems that are better for families.
One of the areas that tribes differ from states in terms of dealing with family problems is this notion of cutting children off from families. The traditional approach in non-Indian communities is to terminate parental rights if the parent's misbehavior reaches a certain threshold. In tribal communities, though, if you cut a child off from their family, from grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, that really is almost active abuse upon that child. Because in the Indian community, things happen based on relationships. Not just who you're related to, but who that child has that they can call on in times of need. And so in increasing numbers of tribes, they're turning to what's called customary adoption, which is this notion that, okay, if your parents can't provide what you need, we'll substitute a new set of parents. But there's no need to substitute grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, siblings. All those people remain intact. So it's like the extended family actually adopts in a new set of parents.
The Indian Child Welfare Act addresses one of the most important issues to the tribes, and that is maintaining their tribal membership base.
You know, our greatest asset as a nation is our children. Well, that's no different for Indian tribes. You know, we have to have that membership there, those citizens there that will help us in the future define who we are as a people and develop our tribes, whether it's doctors, lawyers, our school teachers, our police officers. You know, we have to have those citizens there as a tribal nation. Even recently in the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that was adopted by the U.S. in December 2010, it also talks about collective rights as human rights.
When a judge actually has an experience in coming to a tribe and interacting with tribal members, learning about the culture, I've seen heart changes that could not be communicated or learned through a book, through a workshop, through a presentation. It's something that's on a deeper level of understanding.
If you can do a discussion of the history and you bring in people who've actually lived it or are living it, then it gains a great deal more credence, and people begin to really understand that the decisions being made from the bench have long-reaching ramifications for these children and families, and it becomes a different kind of experience.
We've been fortunate. We've been able to have, at this point, 2 cross-sites visits in Arizona, one with the Gila River Indian community, and we just recently had one with the Pasquayaqui Indian community. We brought together not only, at the last one, we had state judges, tribal judges, we had social workers present, we had prosecutors, we had probation officers, we had defense attorneys, and we had service providers from the tribe, and we all met together, and it was a wonderful day spent together and learned more about each other and each other's processes and made those connections.
What I'd like to say to judges across the country is to never let anyone tell you that you don't have any Native American children that ICWA applies to. It's a lie. It's not true. You do. I don't care whether you're in New York City, Arizona, Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Seattle, Washington, or anywhere in between. There are Native American children that ICWA applies to in your jurisdiction. So ask the question.
And I can't think of a law that I apply every day that allows me to do the right thing more often, honestly. And it's incredibly important, and all judges need to know and understand it and try their best always to do the right thing.
It's a different way of looking at it, but for our children, they don't belong to just the mother and the father, and they don't belong just to the grandparents. They belong to the community. And everybody in that community has a responsibility to make sure that the children are safe, that the children are nurtured, that the children are educated, learning. So just think how much healthier that is, to have a whole community that cares about you, that knows who you are, that knows who your family is. It's a beautiful thing.
And when we say Chatasiyahuke, I am Choctaw, that's who I am. I say it with my language, I feel it in my heart. And that, I think, is the strongest message that any of us can share. I'm sure is with you, with your heritage, who you are, who your people are. Those are the things that make us who we are.
These Indian babies have a whole heritage and a whole culture, a beautiful culture that they need to know.
Live a life of anguish, of hurt, of pain, and just to finally come home. And what was special about it, it wasn't my immediate family, but it was our people.
I felt so connected with who I was as an Indian person in my community and my people and generations back. It was that hole that I had lived with growing up is getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
And standing in that circle and hearing that drum that goes to that place in your heart where there are no words. And that's where the healing needs to begin. And that's where it began for me.